Howdy, all you delicious people. Yeah, so I'm really just gonna bite off really way more than I can chew today. Cause yeah, I didn't otherwise realize how much stuff I had watched, and then ultimately how much I was going to eventually review afterwards. I had kind of just been a little either just kind of mentally or just I was just kind of out of sorts. So reasonably, I'm like going in today, and I just kept watching things, and then I realized today I'm like, okay, so now I need to review all the things that I watched, and then I realized I'm like, oh my god, I like have to do like five reviews of all kinds of things today. So that's what we're gonna do. And then ultimately, eventually, those will come out to the fray eventually. So that'll be great. Uh, So ultimately today we are going to be talking about two movies, ultimately Vanishing on 7th Street, and ultimately we're going to be talking about Plank Face. So really with Plank Face, I would say that this movie is fairly it's kind of on the lower end of budget, and when looking at it, there is a little bit at points, some point in time when really this is just kind of like a very dark story, and most of the time within this movie, you'd have girls that seemingly have no tops on or no bottoms throughout a bulk of this film. But yeah, so that might be the appeal for you guys to be able to want to go out of your way to say you saw this movie, especially if you are a guy or a girl who likes girls as well. Um, Very much a like I thought it was interesting enough to go back and talk about this one, just because of the absurdity of the title and just the imagery alone is just interesting enough to just check it out. Even though there is like a scene here and there where I dare say it's a little bit of a gross out moment. But other than that, let's also first off, talk about where you could see both of these movies if you want to check them out. Vanishing on 7th Street is kind of like almost free everywhere. I saw it on Tubi. That's a free movie and TV service that you could say you went out of your way to watch at some point in time. But I think this is currently, at the second of this recording, also free on YouTube, and I think also free on Vudu as well. Plank Face, I believe, ultimately was a voodoo movie that ultimately was free. I'd have to check that out because ultimately I did not prep for that before this video. Yeah, it was free on Tubi, is also free on Vudu. So ultimately, you can see both of these movies right now, the second of this recording, on Vudu for free. Uh, Whether or not when this video goes out or whatever. But anyways, uh, so let's ultimately talk about The Vanishing on 7th Street. So ultimately, this movie has, of course, Hayden Christensen, which ultimately a lot of people more than likely remember him from the Star Wars prequels. I would probably remember him mostly from the movie Jumper, or uh, the movie that I really did enjoy, Life is a House, which ultimately had Kevin Kline in it, which I thought that was an amazing film. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a just beautiful movie. But also I saw Hayden Christensen also in the Nicolas Cage film Outcast. John Leguizamo, I've of course seen him on The Pest, and ultimately I've seen him like Super Mario Brothers and the happening and stuff like that. It seems like I eventually try to go out of my way to eventually see a Jean Leguizamo movie, because ultimately I just love his work. Thandie Newton, which ultimately plays Rosemary in this movie. She I know from Chronicles of Riddick, and ultimately I think she's maybe done a Mission Impossible movie, I think. probably Mission Impossible 2. So yeah, those are all the cats and characters that are really the most important kind of people. Because and also a Jacob Latimore, which ultimately plays James, I think is the guys that otherwise had the most screen time. Everybody else is just kind of background noise. Uh, because ultimately, what happens in this movie? So when you see the word vanishing, you can probably figure out within this movie that we have it to where reasonably we have a whole town of people. We have a whole place of people, and within one just brief power outage, all of a sudden, absurdly, a lot of people just vanish. There is no real answer to why. There is no real answer of what's really going on. It's just kind of a journey to fight the moonlight, so to speak. And ultimately, I will get into more specifics when we get into a review. If ultimately this movie kind of reminded me of like Alone in the Dark or whichever that one movie was with the Tooth Fairy woman that ended up going after people. That might have, or maybe it's not Alone in the Dark. Maybe it's Darkness Falls. It's been a while since I've seen that movie. Ultimately, if you look up a horror movie that has tooth fairies in it, and you have got a guy that ultimately is having night terrors and stuff like that, where he has to live with a flashlight on, I think that might be Darkness Falls. But anyways, it kind of reminded me of that kind of film. More than likely, I should just go out of my way to review that film at some point, whatever title that actually was, because I've talked about it on several times through several movies, because it ends up just kind of consistently coinciding with some of the stuff that I've talked about at some point. So, going into this movie, basically, it's a like it's kind of like I would call it like a floor is lava kind of thing, where you're just kind of trying as much as possible. It's like a game where ultimately you have to like stay in the light kind of thing, and that's the thing that I just kind of enjoy about this movie is the desperation of people that end up just kind of eventually clung together at some point to try to survive. Uh, I thought that this movie was reasonably like I didn't like that it didn't really care to really resolve anything. It just kind of really just when looking at it, I was like, oh, okay, so maybe this is quite possibly just going to be another movie where everyone dies and then that's just it kind of thing. That's what I kind of thought that this movie was. But when really looking at it, I was easily just kind of impressed with this movie. I just liked bits and portions about it. Uh, at some points, there was some kind of questioning of acting stuff where I'm like, man, I don't really like this delivery of this actor, or I don't like uh, how reasonably it's just kind of like everything is kind of like forced together, and like there's little bits and pieces that you can kind of complain about, but when looking at it, it doesn't seem like we're going to be getting any new releases anytime soon for anything, so it's better to just kind of kind of siphon through and lick the bowl clean of every little thing that you can watch at this point, because ultimately it's not like you're going to see anything new coming down the pipeline anytime soon. So let's go into spoilers about this movie. Let's crack down on the double five to otherwise spoil this film. Because at the end of the day, there's not a whole ton a lot to say about all these things within this movie, or either both of these movies, because it's kind of simple in its execution, and it's kind of simple in its approach. So let's ultimately break down the people that end up showcasing upon themselves within this movie. So, the very first journey of which to go into is ultimately to talk about John Leguizamo's character, which is ultimately Paul. So let's get into that spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about time again to spoil this movie. So John Leguizamo plays this character called Paul, who ultimately is a projection person for a movie theater. I'm like, are they still doing reels with projectors? I'm like, I thought by this point in time it would be like all digital now, and like people wouldn't have to deal with camera reels anymore, because ultimately like the old camera reels, they used to be all like you'd have to like watch the transitions of every film to just try to like that's when before they would have like intermissions and stuff with films so that way people could switch the films uh, in between like act 2 and 3 and whatever. Now I thought it would be all digital, and but who knows? So John Leguizamo is a movie theater projectionist, and ultimately he's like a maintenance man of sorts for this movie theater. And so he heads out to get himself a little drink of a Slurpee of something, because immediately when I would go to a movie theater, I would go and get like a Slurpee or something. I wouldn't get some just kind of generic pop. But then again, I'm sure that'd be like high on sugar if you ultimately were just to have that all the time. Mood point. So we ultimately have Paul who goes out to get a little drink of something, and we ultimately have a cashier that is behind the counter who's ultimately hitting on Paul and ultimately like, maybe I can get a slice of that if you know what I mean. This cashier that is ultimately working at this movie theater, because it seems like we have it to where. Uh, this cashier is just like, well, hey, maybe I'll see you around sometime. And Paul's like, yeah, maybe I will. And so we have it to where Paul walks off, and then ultimately he is working on the projectors, and all of a sudden everything goes completely dark. And so Paul ends up having a light on top of his head all the time, anyways. Like, I thought it was interesting when he was like approaching the cashier, and ultimately he had the light still on his head to ultimately just be like, well, we're gonna have this light on all the time anyways. So ultimately the lights go out, and we have to where Paul ultimately walks out with just an entire environment filled of clothes, and that's it. Like, as if like 85 people are all just walking around town just butt naked, because they ultimately were just like, dude, we just got to get rid of all of our clothes. Let's slap them all over the floor. So we ultimately have Paul walking out into the great white beyond, ultimately saying, where the heck is everybody? Why are all these clothes on the ground? Is everyone running around naked? What's going on? Nobody's asking these questions. So we have to move on. So we ultimately have Marianne, who I kind of have to question some of her delivery of some of these lines. Like, I don't blame Newton. I just kind of like, it kind of seems like there's a lot of like overacting going on in this role. Like, there's a lot of like she has to do a lot of like a lot of like conveying stuff, and a lot like she like I guess since she probably doesn't get much of any of these kinds of roles. I think she maybe she or whoever told her to do this kind of just did like way over too much. Like, I think she could have pulled back a little bit. But anyways, and again, that's no fault of Newton. That's probably the director ultimately saying, "No, I want more. Give me more." So we ultimately have to where Rosemary is ultimately a worker at a hospital. That ultimately we have her kind of just strolling around in the hospital. I believe she's probably a girl that ultimately has a baby at this hospital, because ultimately we find her yelling for her baby that is gone once the light goes out. Ultimately, also Rosemary kind of just starts like strolling around this hospital after the lights go out to find that some guy's chest is open, and because ultimately they were doing some surgery on him, and ultimately he had woken up after all the doctors had been gonzo. So, and so that kind of imagery is like, whoa, like somebody's like in mid heart in or in mid surgery, and you have the patient's like, help me, because ultimately, like, yeah, like his chest is freaking open. So we have it to where now Hayden Christensen, Luke, ultimately is to have woken up. Like, I don't know when exactly this time period piece is, but it looks like it's maybe like a Valentine's Day thing or an anniversary or something. Because Luke ultimately is talking to a woman that's not there, and ultimately saying, "Hey, honey, where are you at? Where's the bacon? You know what I mean?" Like, I waited up for you as long as I could. And so ultimately there's some kind of decoration and stuff there, ultimately uh, celebrating some sort of something. And so Luke ultimately is looking all around for his woman. I guess he maybe had maybe assumed that she had run off on him, but she didn't. She just ghosted him, literally, not figuratively. So we have it to where ultimately Luke is ultimately trying to check the telly because he woke up. He's trying to check his cell phone, and the cell phone has no battery. And so ultimately he goes all the way down to the place where there's a security guard at his hotel room, and he's ultimately asking his security guard like, "Hey man, what's going on? All kinds of heck is going on. What's happening? What's the vibe?" And we have it to where the security guard is just a thing of clothing. So we ultimately have it to where Luke is trying to figure out answers. So he tries to go to the newspaper stand, and the newspaper stand has the newspaper from the day before. And so Luke is like, "What the heck is going on? This is yesterday's newspaper." As he's seeing an entire uh, part of the street just filled with clothes. And so he's ultimately just like, "What is going on? What's going on?" So we ultimately have it to where, like, it seems that time has passed, and Luke is ultimately in to be a little bit much more disheveled, and ultimately having different clothes on. He ultimately has a coat on that ultimately has lights and stuff like that. And it seems that he is making his way to this bar. Excuse me. Excuse me. Anyways, so we ultimately have it to where Hayden is to make it to this bar, and he's going to take a drink because right after he tries to go to this bar and time has passed, we ultimately have it to where we find out that Luke works at a news station, and we ultimately find that he had tried to use a satellite phone, and that doesn't work. And so he's trying to see if anybody is still there at this news station. It doesn't really seem like there is. It seems that ultimately Luke had noticed that there is some broadcaster that is like doing a TV from Chicago, and ultimately I guess so. There's some bits and pieces of stuff that still quasi works, uh, and so on and so forth. So, but moving on. So Luke gets a drink at this bar, and ultimately to be be a person to worry his sorrows, not thinking that anybody else would be alive. Justifiably, we find James, who's ultimately putting a shotgun to Luke's noggin, ultimately like, "What the heck, man? Like, dude, you're drinking my good hooch." James doesn't say that, but I think it would be funny. But anyways, so we ultimately have Luke, who is having a gun on him now with a kid who ultimately has a shotgun, and so Luke ultimately is just like, hey, like, peace, peace, buddy. Like, dude, I'm like, I'm so happy to finally see another person, you know. And so, how about we go and we sit together? Like, well, I'll serve you a drink of apple juice, I hope, and we'll just talk. Like, if anything, yeah, like to see another human being, it's amazing. So, like, wouldn't it be just great to just talk it out? So James is like, yeah, you know what? I feel quasi similar to the way of which that you're talking. And so ultimately they sit down and we find out. Luke ultimately asks James, why is it that this bar is still the way it is? And recently, James mentions that there is a generator for this bar that is keeping it going. So we have it to where it seems that people are plopping their way into this bar. We ultimately have Rosemary, who had gone to a rave, I guess, on her way from the hospital to a rave, because we have her have all these like glow sticks and all these like rave esh like light sources that are on all over her body. To mention, like, yeah, my flashlight went out, so I just got all these like glow sticks and rave sticks, and I just started just banging it out, you know, just had a really good time. And so we ultimately have it to where Rosemary is a bit of a cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs person, because every single time she's asking if her baby is James or where is her baby, like she's been looking all over the world for her baby, I guess. So we eventually have it to where Luke has to kind of confirm to everybody that Rosemary was a doctor, because evidently her just wardrobe just says doctor all over her bate. And so recently we have it to where Luke is like, oh, okay, well, you're a doctor, you're a kid, and I'm a guy that otherwise played a Star Wars movie at one point. So what are we going to do now? We're going to have to hear a guy shout out from the distance, help me, help me. And that ultimately is John Leguizamo's character that ultimately had gotten uh, freaking clocked in the back of the head, which ultimately gave him a concussion, which ultimately is going to have him yell out, help me, because I'm John Leguizamo, motherfuckers. So ultimately, we have it to where they go out of the bar to hear the cries of John Leguizamo. And also, Luke is to tell us that it seems that the light or that the sun uh, really does very rarely come up, and then shortly thereafter it comes down, and to where they're like consistently living in darkness. So we have it to where ultimately Luke makes the decision of like, dude, I'm not coming for Paul's character. Like, F Paul's character, I'm not coming for him. And then ultimately, like, Rosemary and James are like, but we should do the right thing. We should try to help this person out. And Luke is like, okay, well, since you guys mentioned that I guess we should do the right thing, then fine. So Luke has Rosemary and James go back to the bar, and Luke ends up grabbing Paul and getting him out to be into the bar. Ultimately, Luke is consistently yelling for James at some point. It kind of gets annoying, but it is what it is. So their plan of attack is to ultimately separate, which is always a good move in a horror film. So we ultimately have it to where Luke is mentioning that at some point that they are probably going to run out of juice for this generator. And so really the master plan is to ultimately come up with some alternative source for a consistent flame or consistent light. Uh, and so, because reasonably what happens when these people go into a darkness of sorts is they end up getting consumed by the darkness. which ends up having them uh, be completely, let's just say, sucked out of the clothes that they were at, and ultimately to be just like having their clothes just kind of cave in upon where they were last at. So, like, it's basically like if, like, oh, I'm just gonna put all my clothes on my bed, and then, like, that's just where they are. So, because you're dead. So, we have to where ultimately, James is ultimately trying to work on some light in the bathroom, and Paul is ultimately yelling for James because why wouldn't he? And we have it to where ultimately Luke and Rosemary are trying to find uh, some alternative source of lights and such. Uh, they're ultimately going and trying to find a truck that has high beams because ultimately it's the only truck that ultimately does work. It seems like they are also going to make a journey to the hospital to eventually find rubbing alcohol for some torch and all kinds of things, all kinds of missions. And also, they're going to try and find some girl, which I think is Brianna, that ultimately is to be kind of running around and willy nilly everywhere. And it's probably going to cost somebody their life, but we'll get to that. So, ultimately, so while James and Paul is shouting out to the heavens of James for the 200th time. James, how's it going, James? James, James, I'm so lonely. James, how's it hanging? Slightly to the left? Yeah, that's what I thought, James. So James is ultimately going and getting some light to uh, getting some light of sorts. And so we ultimately have it to where Paul, like before everybody left, he had mentioned, hey, just letting you know that there's some bridge out there that says the word Croatoan. I don't know why, but it's just there. Uh, Maybe it means something. It probably doesn't, but it's just really just there. Isn't that cool? And so everybody's like, yeah, I don't know what that means either. So, and then they all left because they're like, I think that whole story just rubbed everyone the wrong way. So we ultimately have it to where we have Paul, who is ultimately where he is at, which is this billiard table, is slowly but surely like the light is consistently going on and off and on and off. And so we really have it to where Paul is ultimately freaking out about this. And so bizarrely, what is going on in Paul's mind is he's having some weird dream slash hallucination going on where what had happened was is that I think he is seeing like his death coming to an end, or his life coming to an end, I mean. And so reasonably in his head, he's like he is doing this bizarrish dream where he all of a sudden had awake from this billiard table and started walking around, and James was gone. And otherwise, he just kept on like trying to just go through this bar and go into this sewer place and this underground thing that ultimately he kept like walking on and on and on and on until every single light source had went out, and then ultimately the darkness had come for him. Well, then eventually we find out that all that was a hallucination or a dream of sorts because James is perfectly fine, but Paul is still on this billiard table consistently. James, how's it going? So we ultimately have it to where eventually the darkness comes for Paul and ultimately consumes everything of him but his clothes. Because reasonably, man, I really think that this whole darkness thing just is like, you know what? Like, I really need some high end like fabric. Like I just can't just take anybody's clothes. Like I like if anything like they're very picky about the clothes that they pick. So ultimately, they really need some high end threads. So they're not going to just go for anybody's clothes, I guess. So Paul is sucked out of his clothes, and so James is ultimately just like, well, I guess Paul's dead. Nah, that sucks. So the reason we have it to where ultimately, uh, Luke is to eventually come back with this car that ultimately needs to be powered by putting your foot on the gas. Eventually, we find that Luke had twisted his ankle, and what had also happened was that uh, Rosemary had tried to save this Brianna girl, and that had ultimately costed her because when looking at it, for her so intertwined and consumed by her trying to find her baby, otherwise costed her her life. And also, they had to really rely heavily on these high beams to ultimately save them from death, because Luke was consistently asking for uh, Rosemary to like put the high beams on, put them on, so ultimately they could be saved. So justifiably, we have a tour since this Brianna girl ultimately is eventually to be talked about a little bit later. We ultimately have a tour. Luke is going back to James to ultimately get them to get this car to work more and get it started and to ultimately keep the pedal on the gas. So they end up driving off to ultimately go and see this church, and James ultimately sees his mother in the darkness, because we found out that ultimately James had been left at this bar, which ultimately was his mother's, because ultimately his mother had owned this bar. So hence why ultimately he knows how everything works, because reasonably generator and such. So ultimately James is to go and see his mother right around this church. So ultimately he heads into this church all alone. And we ultimately have to where Luke ultimately is to try to figure out like, well, like I don't feel like this church is safe enough, and I think the darkness is gonna get a little nibble on James, so I have to figure out how to get this car into this church, so ultimately we can have as much light as humanly possible. So we ultimately have it to where James is scrambling into this church to ultimately see all this candlelight visual, and we ultimately have it to where James is making it uh, to see where his mother was, and it seems like while he's doing that, the darkness is going to be near and dear to consume him. We have it to where seemingly Luke is ramming his way into this church through these double doors, and so we have the light like fully consume this entire church coincidentally, which kills this darkness from trying to kill James. And so we have it to where Luke stupidly gets out of the car and just ultimately is just like, you know what? How about I just start walking after James? And if anything, like hopefully the like the sputtering of this car will last just long enough for me to get to him. Well, we have it to where ultimately Luke ultimately just put the pedal to metal on this gas level, and then tried to run after James. And sure, far enough, we have to where Luke is just trying as best as he could with his twisted ankle to make it to James, and ultimately this car ultimately runs out of juice, power, whatever, and ultimately that's when you have the high beams turn off, which ultimately at that point in time also kills Luke. I'm like, no! You killed Anakin, you savages. And because all you get to see is just Luke's clothes fall and he's dead. And so you ultimately just see James that is ultimately just by these candles, just having a good old time. And so he's just kind of looking through all the items, and that's when we have Brianna that appears and is like, hey, that's my sleeping place. And so ultimately we have it to where finally the sun eventually comes up, and we are led to just believe that reasonably there's probably going to be not one soul left after all of this, because eventually the sun is going to go up, but then probably as eventually like it's going to come down fairly quickly as well. And reasonably all we are left to see is just kind of like a desecration of just cars just trotted all over the place, and then eventually it's seemingly a horse that is just clopping his way through here. Uh, and that's just how this movie just kind of ends. So ultimately, yeah, I thought that this was a quasi interesting film, but we never really got to the meat and potatoes of much of anything. And reasonably, I thought it was just kind of interesting enough when it really came down to it. It was kind of one of those like, oh, okay, like I'm just okay about how this just went about. So without a doubt, let's move on into Plank Face. Ultimately, I'm going to have to justifiably transition here. So give me 1 second. I'll pause here. We'll just transition. All right. So Plank Face. So reasonably interesting enough. I had seen a movie called Space Babes from Outer Space. And ultimately, after watching this movie, I'd realized, oh yeah, some of those people from that movie worked also on this film. And so reasonably, I guess maybe the same people that did one of the other kind of films. I thought both films are just kind of interesting in their own way. So anyways, what is Plank Face? So reasonably, this kind of reminds me of like a Rob Zombie kind of film, like The Hills Have Eyes or something like that. It kind of reminds me of a Hills Have Eyes, or just kind of like a The Strangers kind of movie. It kind of reminds me with that. But reasonably, it has a lot more of, I would call, bedroom business in here, where ultimately we have a lot more people that are declothed and are otherwise having to forcibly do acts of which that they probably don't want to do, or otherwise one character, let's just say, gets frustrated with another, so ultimately they do a little anger banging things out, if you know what I mean. So within this movie, ultimately we have at points in here, like it's just kind of like a berserker kind of movie where we have these hillbilly ash like people that at some point end up going out within their radius of their location. They end up just going after people and killing them for certain resources, and which is basically they eat them, and so they're cannibals. And so then eventually they go into here, and we have it to where eventually it seems that one person ends up of this group, let's just say, ends up getting murdered. And so recently after that, we have to have a replacement for said murdered person, and that ultimately leads to a young buck that ultimately has to otherwise satisfy the women of this group, let's just say. And so there might be a lot of dancing around in here, where I might have to be dancing around some of the words of which that I say, because ultimately there is not much that ultimately I can mention about stuff going on in this movie, because a lot of it is bang to bang, bang bang bang, a lot of bedroom business. So let's ultimately go into mentioning, like, it's kind of really interesting to watch a film where like there is not much of dialogue. If anything, this kind of movie kind of reminds me of the movie The Survivalist. If you've ever heard of that movie, because I've probably reviewed it at some point. It reminds me of The Survivalist, but also when looking at that, like you could root for the people in the survivalist movie, whereas in this one, like reasonably, like most of the people that are in this film are villainous people that are just like cavemen ash like people that are to live off survival, and like these people have kind of lost all sense of rational real thought processes, and so on and so forth. So reasonably there might be a very tail end ending to this movie that I forgot about, uh, because ultimately when looking at it, like I've had the both of these movies in my brain noggin, but now I have to spell them all out, and plus I have like 4 or 5 other things to talk about as well, and there's only so much memory to be had. So let's ultimately go into the spoiler time of which that this movie goes into, because there might be some portions of this movie that people might visually enjoy, I guess we would have to say at the end of the day. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. By the way, also before we go, if you don't want to hear spoilers about this movie, if anything, I could probably say that this movie, it's kind of low budget, but when looking at it, it kind of also like reminds me of a simple movie called "Don't F in the Woods." Uh, don't F word in the woods. Um, like I saw that movie and I was just like, okay, this movie is kind of like it's really, that one was really low budget, but when looking at it, I was like, you know what, like, but there's some kind of there's kind of just some like quality. There's some kind of something of that movie that ultimately I just kind of was like, you know what, like, nah, like I'll watch this film, and ultimately see a lot of good looking women in it, or good looking just situations and stuff like along those lines. But anyways, it's about that time. So ultimately, in the very beginning of this movie, we ultimately have seemingly a couple that is ultimately wanting to fulfill a fantasy. And evidently, the guy that is otherwise tied to this couple, his fantasy is to do it on the top of his hood. And so we ultimately have the woman that ultimately wants uh, this guy to dance for her. And so ultimately, he tries to, but he sucks at it, and ultimately this girl, like, she has to do it, but then when she does it, it just kind of doesn't really seem like a dance. It just kind of seems like kind of like a slowly but surely kind of process of such. So we ultimately have this guy who ultimately goes and just has a let's just say a opening and closing of a book, let's just say, on top of this, car. Just just books are just to be read and had, uh, if anything, a whole every single time that I have to say something about a book, it's a metaphor for something else. Like, man, are they just opening and really just uh, cracking open these books, if you know what if you know what I mean. And so we have it to where this couple is really enjoying their book together, and they are otherwise just unavoidably unaware of a guy that ultimately has a piece of wood for a face. Not an entire piece of wood. It just kind of covers like a mask over his face. He's kind of an older gentleman. I think his name is called Old Daddy. Because here are the personas that ultimately these Berserker Ash-like people or cavemen Ash-like people because they can't talk very well. They can't talk good. So we ultimately have a character called the Bride, Granny, and Bunny Girl, and Old Daddy. So isn't that just kind of weird? So we ultimately have it to where seemingly Old Daddy can't get it up if you don't. Anyways, so we have it to where Old Daddy is watching over this couple and just watching them reading this book on the top of their car. So ultimately, he goes into taking a knife to these people, and otherwise, we get it to where the girl pulls away from now dead guy, and she otherwise takes a knife from Old Daddy and stabs Old Daddy numerous times to try to escape from him, which ultimately leads to quite obviously their deaths, anyways. But anyways, so we ultimately have it to where Old Daddy is just trotting his way back to this said home to ultimately just live the rest of his days in horrific agony. So we ultimately have it to where seemingly there is a couple called Max and Stacy who are somewhere in the radius of, again, the cavemen people or cave people, like, look, they're in a normal house, but I just call them cavemen because they can't talk. They can just, like, a lot of, like, the stuff that they say doesn't even sound like words, with the exclusion of maybe the word family towards the end of the movie. So we ultimately have it to where reasonably in here that we have Max and we have Stacy who are thinking that they're going to have a good time. But it seems that ultimately we have, I think, Stacy who is going to drop trowel over off to the side or something like that, just kind of go off and do her own thing. And while she is going to do her own thing, we ultimately have seemingly Max being knocked out by a man, and we have this same man ultimately going to greet Stacy with his John Brown tree, let's just say, to say hello. So we ultimately have it to where Max finds this man that ultimately is saying hello to Stacy, and we have it to where ultimately Max uh, gets this guy and kind of gets it to where he ties him up, and because he had done something to his woman, ultimately it's like, oh, well, you like just forcing yourself on a girl? Well, good for you. Ultimately, I'm gonna do something to you that ultimately feels quite similar. So we have it to where Max ultimately has a knife, and we ultimately have that knife ultimately to be disappearing into this guy's tuchus. And so ultimately this guy is dealing with all kinds of pain, and then ultimately we have Max that is just walking off to ultimately be taken by these cave women that ultimately have shotgun in hand, and ultimately to be uh, kind of taken out. So we eventually find that Max is ultimately to have a nail driven through his foot to keep him at bay within this little cabin, and so ultimately their whole entire thing is to take the wood plank that is already on Old Daddy and place it with on Mac's face by ultimately burning it onto Max's face. That is ultimately the game plan, let's just say, and to ultimately make Max and manipulate him into doing whatever they want, because ultimately, if he doesn't do what they want, ultimately they will take a shotgun to his face and force him to do it. Not shoot him, but just ultimately just manipulate him. And ultimately, Max is led to believe that the woman of which that he had been with had died, and so reasonably they are giving him no real reason to live. So we ultimately have it to where after Max gets the piece of wood upon his face, troll, you can only see one eye of his face. We ultimately have it to where seemingly eventually that these people feed him, and eventually like he won't eat, he won't whatever. So ultimately it seems that at first the bride of sorts is ultimately just like, well, like I'm gonna give him a reason to live, or I'm just gonna kind of like try to romanticize him to or just try to get him to just uh, like be happier. So the only way that I think that I can do that is just by basically just trying to please this man, let's just say. And so we have it to where ultimately the bride is otherwise getting on top of Max, and ultimately it seems that uh, the bride is ultimately just getting frustrated just because Max won't 100%, let's just say, give in to the bride. So, meaning that ultimately Max won't be able to have a happy ending, let's just say. And to where ultimately we have it to where the bride is ultimately pulled off of frustration to have then Granny otherwise be a person that is going to make Max have a happy ending of sorts, to where to otherwise give his bride as well as just the other characters eventually a baby at some point, because that's the whole thing. So this is just the most absurd moment in this movie, but when looking at it, I've seen much more absurd movies, sadly enough. But when looking at it, I've seen this movie more than once now, and ultimately, I don't know, I thought it was like visually bizarre, and or like it just always stuck out to me because like there's visuals in here that I'm like, this is so different than anything else that I've seen, and it's just like ultimately just F it. Let's talk about it at this point, because there's some movies where it's just like F it. Like I've already done this once, so let's figure out a more convenient way to kind of skirt around a lot of things. So we ultimately have it to a reasonably uh, we have it to where there's just this consistent like fighting out of just kind of like sneaking into just really Max's manhood of sorts, because ultimately we have it to where it seems that the bunny girl is ultimately just kind of ultimately while Max is sleeping she just jumps on him, and we have it to where Max ultimately at some point like has a aggressive moment with Bunny Girl, because reasonably it's like, dude, you woke me up and freaking like you woke me up doing this, and so F you. Like I am just gonna have my way, just because reasonably like you angered me, so I'm gonna make this hurt for you because ultimately that's what like you were hurting me. So, anyways, we ultimately have to where it seems that Bunny Girl is ultimately taking for a liking with Max, but it just seems that Max is just going to end up just ultimately just consistently going with either the bride or the bunny girl consistently throughout this movie, just having his time of his life, let's just say. even though he's not happy at all with any of this. He's just kind of forced into doing this, and really to the point where his brain is just mush, and he just gives in to everything. And towards me, he's just kind of dragged off to just get washed off by this pond or this lake or whatever, and ultimately for them to just kind of drag him around like he's just a sack of potatoes. So we ultimately go on to here, and reasonably, we have it to where in this movie that what ends up happening is it seems like there is some ritual that is going on. Every single time that there is some man that otherwise is justifiably around Granny and them, it seems like they have to do a little chopping of the as you would say in a metaphorical term, like a man's twig and berries, ultimately they take off the berries, let's just say, and they have to have Max ultimately, uh, I guess, consume those berries for potency to have him be able to give these women a child. Or ultimately just kind of give him the ability to be strong enough for these women, I guess. So weird. But hey, it's a movie. So we go on to here, and so our journeys are just the long and winding roads. So we go on to here, and so reasonably, Max eventually becomes their old daddy. But he's still his same age or whatever. There's no time that has passed or whatever. But so we have to where this guy has been manipulated so far and beyond. Ultimately, he is burning his driver's license, burning the money of which that he had. And ultimately, it seems that Granny at some point is going to mention to him that he, as well as these women, are family. And ultimately to say, yeah, the brainwashing has worked. So we ultimately have it to where eventually we have Max, aka Plankface, that is to ultimately go and find a man that ultimately is in some juncture of this road. And this guy ends up pulling out of his car and like, hey man, are you okay? What's going on? Why are you shirtless? And so ultimately we have it to where the plank face man ultimately chops down this would be driver, and ultimately we eventually have it to where again this man is to be left to be having his berries just taken without him, and ultimately to be eaten again, and to have Max have his way with these women, of course. Eventually, at some point, it seems that we found that the bunny girl's mask uh, was broken. So ultimately, eventually, it seems that Plankface ultimately fixes this bunny mask to ultimately uh, bunny girl ultimately is assuming that like Max really does like truly love her, and so that is the symbolism behind all of this. So we eventually have it to where reasonably, since Plankface has really earned these girls whatever respect, just earned their trust. So ultimately, these women take Max back to this tree, which otherwise has been holding Stacy this entire time. And we have it to where Stacy is ultimately talking to Max. He's like, "Oh my God, is that you, Max? Like, are you okay? Like, what did they do to you?" Like, it's kind of like the Indiana Jones moment where ultimately it's the Kali Mom moment where ultimately like Harrison Ford is like changed, and you have the woman that is like, "What happened to you, Indy? What happened to you?" And so ultimately the cave women are ultimately just like, you know what to do. Like, you need to kill this girl, so that way you can like you can definitely take every single bit of what you were, and it be gone. So we ultimately have it to where, again, girls have shotgun in hand, and so reasonably we have it to where Max is still completely and utterly brainwashed, and so we have it to where ultimately Max takes a axe to Stacy and kills her, ultimately to let us believe that otherwise Max is just going to be playing face forever. And that's just kind of the tail end of this movie. And really, I don't think that there was anything quite after that. Like, I would have assessed that ultimately Max would have just like earned their trust so well that eventually he would have just like went after all of them and then just caught them off guard one by one or something like that. But ultimately that just didn't happen, or you would have thought that ultimately there would have just been kind of like this moment of like Max kind of eventually like kind of getting to the point of like one by one going after one of them, but then eventually maybe just like the last girl or whatever, ultimately you would have just not been able to kill. Maybe Bunny Girl, just because ultimately it seemed like there was a relationship there. I don't know. And then ultimately they would have just kind of moved on with a, if they were to ever do a sequel of this, which if because ultimately this movie probably was one of those where there was maybe not much money to try to make out of this, so or try to have to make this movie, so it's probably maybe something that they easily made out of just kind of spare change and whatever. But who knows? So if anything, I think with that, I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to go. So hopefully somebody got something out of this review, I hope, at the end of the day. Because in a lot of ways, like, some of these reviews are always just kind of just like, at the end of the day, it's like, Matt, like, why not just talk about this movie and whatever? It always gets down to that point of just kind of like, well, I could not talk about any movies, or I could just ultimately just whatever kind of just stuck out to me visually. Ultimately, at the end of the day, might stick out to another person. So, anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.